So these are very, very exciting times in Israel. And, The Economist is one of my favorite media organizations, considered to be one of the most serious media organizations. And their research division, it's called the Economist Intelligence Unit, publishes every year what they call the Democracy Index. And they have four categories. Believe it or not, Israel is not in the top category. Israel is considered to be a flawed democracy in the eyes of the economist. And when you read the explanation, you can go online and read the explanation. It has a lot to do with the legislation, with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, with the situation with the Arabs. But if there's anything that every astute observer of Israeli political system can draw any conclusion, is that Israeli democracy is perhaps one of the most robust, vibrant, and I dare to say stable democracies in the world. And the reason I say this is because this democracy, unlike other democracies, managed to survive the technological disruption, which, like in the United States, was manifested in an unprecedented onslaught on the system, on the establishment, and I'll talk a lot about that. But here you have the Economist ranking for 2019 to 2020 is probably the same. 2021, we're still waiting for it. The system in Israel, a few general words about the system in Israel, is from a structural point of view, it's not different than the American system. But when you look at the components of the system, you couldn't find two more different systems in the world. First of all, in Israel, unlike the United States, we don't have a constitution. This is a fundamental difference. What we do have is the proclamation of independence, and the decision made by the first Israeli Knesset not to aspire to draw and draft a constitution, but rather to turn it into a modular process, if you may, through the legislation of what we call basic laws. So from a legal point of view, Israel is very different than the United States. We do have the Proclamation of Independence that serves as some non-binding legal document, but there is a set of basic laws that is supposed to eventually replace the Constitution. Another major fundamental difference in Israel, like in many countries in Europe, there is no separation between religion and state. It causes a great deal of friction, especially with world Jewry, especially with North American Jewry. In Israel, the prime minister does not have any presidential powers. In fact, from a legal point of view, the Israeli prime minister is first among equals, and he enjoys immunity just like any other member of the Knesset, only within the framework of his or her work. So sometimes many friends I have in Canada and the United States ask me about the Israeli prime minister, assuming that the Israeli prime minister has some presidential powers. The only organizations that he can direct without the approval of the government cabinet is the intelligence community organizations, meaning the Secret Service and the Mossad. The relationship between business and government in Israel is heavily regulated, certainly in American terms, and possibly also in Canadian terms. And I say Canadians because I see that many Canadians on the call, including my dear friend Manette Malevsky, who is an inspiration to me, a great Jewish leader in Canada. On a scale of religiosity, I know it may sound crazy to you, but Israel is far more secular than the United States. On a scale of religiosity, you will never find in Israel "In God We Trust," right, on a dollar bill. And the most important difference, while in the United States and in many other countries, the impact of the technological revolution is that the political discourse is pulling, the gravitation is towards the extremes. In Israel, everybody wants to be a centrist. So the gravitation in Israel is towards the center. And it's a huge difference between the political dynamics in the United States, where we lost a viable center, meaning people like Joe Lieberman, people like um, um, I can come up with some other names. McCain, definitely an example of the kind of political leadership that can bridge the differences, the ideological differences between the two sides. Now, in Israel, which is something, again, most people find it hard to accept and understand, how come a person who is charged and accused, or even a person who already served time in jail, like we have a former minister of the Interior, Aryeh Deri, is a convicted felon. He spent time in jail, came back made a comeback and was reelected. How can that be? And the answer is that in the Israeli law, in the Israeli system, the right to be elected is sacred. It's above everything. The right to be elected is why the Israeli law is so permissive when there are people that are, in the case of Netanyahu, he served as prime minister, although he's being accused of some very serious things, and we will talk about that. The Knesset in Israel is the sovereign. Unfortunately, the Knesset in Israel, the parliament, is suffering from acute weakness in the last several decades, and there are many reasons for it. Again, I think it has a lot to do with the technological disruption. But the legal voting age in Israel is 18. The entire nation serves as one election district. So if in the United States you have hundreds of districts producing 435 representatives, in Israel, you can think of Israel just as one district, electing 120 representatives. And so the multi-party system basically forces you to create a coalition. The coalition is a legal partnership. There are legal agreements signed between the various coalition partners in order to get past the threshold. The threshold is 3.25% of the total number of eligible votes, which is around 140,000 votes, will get you one member of the Knesset in, and the minimum, of course, is 4. This is the process. 120 seats, 61 are needed to form a coalition. This is usually the timeline. I won't spend much time on this. The first party, the party that came up first, the leader receives a mandate from the president. This is perhaps the only executive role the president of the state of Israel is playing. Usually the president position in Israel is largely ceremonial, has a very important role socially and culturally, but not politically. This is the only instance where the president actually can exert some power. And so it goes 28 plus 28 plus 21. So if you fail, which happened to Netanyahu several times, your second party leader gets the chance, or the person who has the best chance of forming coalition, and then another 21 days, or the president can go back to the Knesset and say, you know what, this hot potato belongs to you. You guys solve this problem. I don't know what to do. Now, the situation has been, and I know if you listen to Israeli media, you may believe what you hear, that this is a very fragile government. Actually, this is a very stable government. Let me explain why. It's true that this government won by a very narrow margin, 60 versus 59, but that was only tactical. The truth is that the Arabs have no other coalition, which means the Arabs will never support an alternative coalition. So when you look at the Arab parties, the United Arab List has four members that joined the coalition, and then you have six members from the Arab Joint List that are supporting the Knesset, this coalition from the outside. So actually, you're looking at a different formula here, where 67 members of the Knesset will support this coalition. And it will be very difficult, if not impossible, for the opposition to defeat this coalition in a simple no confidence vote. But the real factor why this coalition is extremely stable is called Benjamin Netanyahu. You may say that Benjamin Netanyahu was the most important person in the previous coalition, and he remains the most important person in the current coalition, although he's now the head of the opposition. How come? Because if you look at this chart, the only thing that keeps those elements together is the fact that they oppose Netanyahu. They oppose his style mostly. They oppose everything that he represents. They oppose the kind of discourse that he introduced. And it has very little to do with ideology. And I would even dare to say very little to do with policy, but it has everything to do with him individually, with his personality. Which means that if Netanyahu steps aside, the glue that keeps this coalition together may disappear and dissolve. And so the real threat to the stability of this coalition, the one thing that stands between this coalition and survivability, is a Netanyahu decision. If he decides to stay in political life, this coalition is safe. I would say it's safer than money in the bank if he decides to stay in political life. If he decides to resign, this coalition is in real danger. Now, right now, it doesn't look like he has any intention to resign. And which means, but that doesn't mean that, things will not change. I remember, I think it was the Lapin Foundation event when I spoke during the Gaza war only a few weeks ago, and about Naftali Bennett announcing that he will not be joining Lapid, and he ended up joining Lapid. So you can never know, you can never predict what will happen in Israeli politics. But it's important to understand Likud, as it stands now, does not have 61 to unseat the new coalition. And it doesn't look like, and again, if Netanyahu will not step aside, Likud will be facing a real danger of disintegration, as happened in the past. What does it mean? It means that a few challengers within Likud may break out from Likud and join the coalition. This is a very, very real scenario. Now, when you look at what happened in Israel in the last, I would say, 6 years since 2015, when Netanyahu was projected to lose to the Zionist camp led by Isaac Herzog, who's now elected the president. And he won against all odds, and his victory was very, very significant. He won by a margin of 6 mandates. And many observers point to that particular election campaign as the turning point. That's when Netanyahu really began to believe his own mythology, that he is invincible, that he is a magician, that he is he masters politics like none other. And from that point on, Netanyahu waged war on what we call in Hebrew mamlachtiyut, which means in English maybe constitutionalism. When you look at the Knesset, it became weaker than ever. When you look at the Knesset committee, which were targeted, when you look at even the municipal leadership, definitely the ministries, the state controller, the court system was targeted very, very heavily, and even the attorney general. Very similar to the kind of onslaught that was launched against American civil service and the American establishment by the Trump administration and by Trump personally. Israel experienced the same thing. Now, Israeli political leaders usually do not rely on heavy research, deep sociological and psychological research, but the one political leader in Israel that did that, that relied on serious, deep research, concluded that the real thing that bothered Israelis is this. That's what I showed you. This was the real thing that bothered the Israelis because it translated into a real frightening sense of chaos, of anarchy, of lack of governance. So the result was the 36th government of the state of Israel. It's a 7-party coalition, as I mentioned before. A coalition, it means there's a set of legal arguments, legal contracts signed between 7 parties. In this case, there's one legal contract between Yair Lapid's Yesh Atid and Naftali Bennett's Yamina that serves as the foundational legal agreement. And then there are separate agreements signed between Yesh Atid and the other 5 parties comprising the coalition. The key person in this new coalition is Yair Lapid. He may not be the most well-known or the most internationally recognized, but he is the key person. Now, he did something that was considered impossible. He basically orchestrated, he was the architect of one of the most complex political maneuvers in Israel's history that produced a government with 9 females. We have 33% of the ministers, first time in Israel's history, females. We have the first LGBTQ political leader, a head of political party. His name is Netanyahus, and he is now the Minister of Health. He's the head of the left-wing party called Meretz. And we have the first Islamist party. And here, the gratitude and the recognition should certainly go to Netanyahu himself, who at one point, in an attempt to salvage his chances to be reelected and reestablish a coalition, started courting the most radical faction within the Arab-Israeli political spectrum, thus legitimizing all the Arab parties. And that was basically, from his point of view, it was a strategic mistake. I think from the point of view of the state of Israel, it was actually a good thing because now it opens the door to the integration of the Arab population into Israeli society. So the 7 heads of the 7 parties that comprise the coalition have one thing in common: they're all interdependent upon each other, right? So I mentioned the Yair Lapid. Lieberman is perhaps the the adult in the room. He is the most experienced political leaders. He's the Minister of Finance. Naftali Bennett's the first prime minister in Israel's history to enter the job with such a narrow political base. We'll talk about Naftali Bennett in a second. The real hero, these are all very important players, but the person that really made this 4th election cycle different than any other cycle is Gideon Sa'ar, who's now serving as the Minister of Justice, and he's projected to become within 2 years the Minister of Foreign Affairs, because Gideon Sa'ar's refusal to join the Likud gave the majority to the anti-Netanyahu bloc. And then you have Mansour Abbas. Again, whether you like what he says or not, no one can take this from him. He's the first Arab politician to ever join Israeli coalition, which means he has a piece of the budget pie. Big deal for the Arab population. Then Merav Michaeli, the leader of labor, new minister of transportation, and Nitzan Horowitz, I mentioned, the leader of Meretz, is the new minister of health. These are the people that will run the state of Israel. You can add to that Benny Gantz, who's the minister of defense, but he was part of the previous coalition as well. But these are the 7 people that made this a reality. These are the 7 people that had to really bridge tremendous gaps in ideology, in policy, in philosophy to create this coalition. And again, Benny Gantz is not included in this group because he was already there, and I don't think that the ideological and the policy leap for him was that dramatic. Now, Naftali Bennett in many ways is the accidental prime minister, very much like Ehud Olmert. You know how Ehud Olmert became prime minister is because Ariel Sharon fell ill. He had a brain aneurysm, and Ehud Olmert was elected as part of Likud. I think it was not even in the top 20, um, and he doesn't have a real public base in Israel. 2 election cycles ago, he didn't even make the threshold, meaning he did not even win 3.5% of the vote. There's no doubt in my mind he will be challenged and tested by Hamas from the south, by Hezbollah from the north. It's only a question of time. And what it seems like he's exercising very wisely informational distancing. What does it mean? He understands that what the Israeli public want is peace and tranquility. And so he is not out there every day in the media. He is not jumping on every opportunity for exposure, as the new prime minister is acting very wisely so far. It's been only less than 2 weeks, but so far you haven't seen him too much in front of the cameras. He's not tweeting. He's not doing any of those things. He understands. He gets it. The Israeli public wants peace and quiet. They want to know that the government is working for them, and the government is working diligently for the people. And that's really, I think, the now another precedent in the case of Bennett is, of course, the story of Itzhak Shamir. Itzhak Shamir was the non-charismatic Speaker of the House under a very dominant Prime Minister Menachem Begin. And in 1983, 6 years after Menachem Begin won the elections, he won the elections in 1977, well into his second term, as a result of the tumult of the First Lebanon War, which Menachem Begin led together with Ariel Sharon. Menachem Begin unexpectedly writes a note that says, "I can't take it anymore," and abruptly resigns and goes to his home, where he spends the rest of his life. Never left the apartment, and sunk into deep depression, clinical depression. He was replaced by, again, most unlikely leader, Itzhak Shamir, who was a leader that emerged out of compromise. I remember this as if it was yesterday. Everybody was, who is this Itzhak Shamir? Well, he was the Speaker of the House, but very, very, he was not considered a leader. He was not charismatic. He was not a player. He was not a great communicator. But guess what happened? 6 months into his premiership, into his term, he won 70% approval rating from the Israeli public. 70. How come? He just quieted the system down and just started working. He did not hold press conferences every day. And he just gave people the sense that someone is working for you. And that's really the essence of what needs to be done. Now, geopolitically, don't expect this government to do much because of the ideological differences within the coalition. So, for example, don't expect them to announce any major breakthroughs vis-a-vis the Palestinians. It's not going to happen. They will try to continue the trend that was started under President Trump, normalization with the Arab and the Muslim world. But again, given the makeup of this coalition, I find it hard to believe that Saudi Arabia, for example, will move forward with the normalization agreement in Israel at this particular time. As I said before, this coalition is going to be challenged by Hamas from Lebanon, about Hamas from Gaza, and Hezbollah from Lebanon. It's only a question of time. That's exactly what happened to Ehud Olmert. Again, a unpopular, seemingly weak prime minister is elected. In the case of Olmert, in the summer of 2000, immediately was challenged by Hezbollah. He made a decision to wage the second Lebanon war. And again, the jury's still out whether this was a good decision or not. He claims that it brought about, I don't know how many years, 16 years of quiet. On the other hand, other people will tell you, well, it allowed Hezbollah to amass an unprecedented number of Katyusha rockets and precision weapons and so on. Iran another major hot potato, what to do with the Biden administration's perceived intention to resume the agreement with Iran. I believe that this government will not change the policy of the previous government, but will change the style. So rather than just say I'm against it and not offer anything, instead, what this coalition will do is, first of all, demand a place around the table, demand to be part of the conversation, which was not necessarily the case under Obama, and Trump was, of course, encouraged by Israel to quit the agreement. And another major decision that this government will have to do is what to do with Turkey, and again, how to handle the United States of America and the Biden administration, the fact that Israel is facing the danger of losing the bipartisanship. The support of both parties has been a pillar of Israeli foreign policy, and we somehow lost it since 2015. And again, is it reversible? I know that this government is very much interested in reversing this process. Question is if the genie is out of the bottle or not. And again, I'll be happy to, if we have more time, to discuss that. But the place where this coalition will feel very comfortable is, of course, domestically. They will try to pass a budget. We haven't had a budget for almost 3 years now. Usually the governments will aspire to have what's called a biannual budget for 2 years. It will give them the peace of mind and the stamina to work and to make decisions. They will try to fix, again, in light of the onslaught against Israeli constitutionalism, they will try to fix and improve Israeli governance and civil service. For example, 39 diplomatic appointments were stuck under Netanyahu. They were released yesterday, including the appointment of a new consul general in New York, who's a former minister of tourism, who's a great guy, and I'm happy for him. The legal system, again, will be protected better than before, more than before. The healthcare system that really, the COVID-19 all over the world, by the way, exposed systemic deficiencies. In Israel, the healthcare system did not collapse, but we discovered that we don't have enough hospitals, and Israel is a member of the OECD, which is the elite club of economies in the world. And when you look at what happened to Israel in the last 15 years, we went way down to the bottom of the list in terms of the number of beds per capita, and when you compare Israel to other countries. And then, of course, dealing with the social rift within Israel, the tension between the various tribes, especially the Haredi and the Arab Israelis. These are two groups that need special treatment. As I mentioned before, Yair Lapid is the only political candidate that conducted real research, serious research. And this is what he discovered. He discovered that Israelis are concerned of chaos and anarchy. That was the main thing. That was the main thing. 300,000 members of Likud did not vote this time. They did not vote. They did not want to vote against Netanyahu, but they also did not want to vote for Netanyahu. We call it the Netanyahu fatigue. And then, of course, information overload plays a major role in any political campaign in the Western world. Why? Because it creates a tremendous distortion of reality. We'll talk about that in a second. So when you look at Netanyahu's 12 years, things that you would consider in the United States as clearly path to progress, I would say that Israel's international standing, that's a huge credit that Netanyahu should receive. Israel is enjoying an unprecedented intimacy today with the world's most populous nations, including China and India and Brazil, not to mention other countries like Nigeria and so on. Israel's economy is robust, is doing well. So these are two things that the credit definitely should go to Netanyahu. He was at the helm during those 12 years, and that's when it happened. Where no progress was achieved is, of course, most painfully on the Iranian issue. Netanyahu's flagship issue was the Iranian nuclear program. Sadly, when he reassumed the position of prime minister in 2008, I believe that the Iranians had 30 kilos of enriched uranium. Today, they have nearly 3 tons of enriched uranium. And it's a resounding failure. And not to mention the many billions of dollars that were spent on this and the controversial style. So Iran is definitely, we haven't seen any progress there. Hamas and Hezbollah, again, are we better today than we were in 2009? Again, resounding failure on both fronts, Hamas and Hezbollah. They're stronger than ever. And that happened under Netanyahu's watch. And when you look at Israel's performance, again, all you have to do, and I'll show you some slides coming from the OECD, Israel deteriorated in almost every aspect of its performance when you compare Israel to the members of the OECD. What are the trademarks of the 12 years of Netanyahu in power? The first is risk aversion, which is good and bad. It's good because risk aversion prevents, capitalizing on dangerous opportunities. It's bad because sometimes it leads to, no progress, as I said here. Agenda setting was his mastery. That's really, if you look at all the things that he knows, and he knows to do a lot of things, a very, very talented human being. But setting the agenda, using media, using national media, using social media, is a very, very, takes a lot of skill, and he has that skill. He managed to set the agenda. Now, setting the agenda doesn't mean that I'm able to tell you what to think. But through setting the agenda, I can tell you about what to think. And that's the big difference. And Netanyahu was a master of setting the agenda. He's still trying to do it, by the way, as the head of the opposition. It's going to be less and less possible for him as national media will less pay attention to his position, to his statements, to his, just the other day, he convened a press conference. He said, I have a very important foreign policy message to deliver, in the media as some sort of a Pavlovian reaction, covered this live. And of course, after 2-3 minutes, they realized there's nothing dramatic about it, and they just left. And the social media illusion is a very, very important thing. We have to understand the echo chamber is creating an illusion. Because it's in my feed, I think it's in everybody's feed. And so Netanyahu, through agenda setting, was able to create the illusion he has a mighty base. And everybody was afraid of his base. The truth is that the night Netanyahu was ousted, you would expect a leader of a country of almost 9.5 million people to have tens of thousands of people marching in his support in front of the official residence. The reality is that there were less than 150 people, according to Israeli police. And if you listen to former Likud members, most of them were actually paid to be there. And that's not a big sign of real base. So there's an illusion of base. The real base is Likud. It's a popular party. Likud is a stronger brand here than Netanyahu. And this, if there's one political conclusion that we can draw from recent events, is that Likud as a brand is much stronger than Netanyahu as a brand. And people's loyalty at the end of the day, despite of the spin put on things by Netanyahu and his people, the real loyalty is to Likud as a brand and not to the individual leader of Likud in any given moment. And we can talk about that during the Q&A session. And this is really the balance of bad governance, is when you're risk averse and you let the risks, you see only risks and you don't see opportunities, that leads to paralysis and stagnation. And that's exactly what happened. And the Israelis are very, very politically savvy, and they noticed it. And that's why Netanyahu failed 4 times in a row to win in elections. And of course, you add to that his highly complicated legal situation. I know many of my American and Canadian friends tell me, what's the big deal? Just a couple of bottles of champagne and cigars. And I tell them, well, I strongly recommend, if you're asking what's the big deal, I strongly recommend that you read the accusations. The Israeli Attorney General published the accusations, 65 pages. And after you read the accusations, you'll understand the severity of his legal problems. And again, no one wants to see another prime minister or another president or another political leader behind bars. And contrary to what Netanyahu himself may think, I don't think his political rivals want to see him behind bars. Um, but let me tell you, you read those 65 pages, you will not, if you love Israel, you will not sleep well at night. I read it, and it was not pleasant. And these are the 3 cases he's being accused of. Very, very serious stuff. It's not about champagne and cigars. It's about violating the law. It's about changing regulation. It's about legislating against your political opponents in order to benefit others, economic interests. I mean, these are world-class accusations. I mean, you have to read this document to believe. And this was written by someone that he appointed. This was not written by someone who was known for his opposition to Netanyahu. This is an attorney general that Netanyahu himself appointed, who was extremely loyal to him until 2015. Look at Israel's performance, and I will end with that. This is something that we have to change very, very quickly. The amount of money that comes into Israel's economy indicates a severe underperformance on the part of Israel, a country that gave the world some of the most advanced innovations, from instant messaging to the technologies that came out of Israel, the science that comes out of Israel. My friend Dr. Milch is on the call, will tell you, in cancer treatment, in other areas, is worth trillions, not billions, trillions. And so to look at this list and see that Israel in 2014 brought in only $6 billion worth of direct investment. I mean, it's nothing. Israel should be able to attract tens of billions, if not more, every year. Because if you think of the real value of the innovation that came out of Israel, it is priceless.